Mr. President, talks on the debt ceiling continue, and the Republican and Democrat leaders of the House and Senate are meeting with President Biden again today. I hope that's a positive sign, because if the President's Treasury Secretary is correct, we could be 2 weeks away from the United States beginning to default on its debts, something that would have very serious consequences for our economy and for our nation's financial standing. And if we're going to get a debt limit increase, the President's going to have to negotiate with Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans. Really negotiate, Mr. President, which means that President Biden is going to have to accept some real spending reforms, because otherwise a debt limit increase is not going to make it through the House of Representatives. Those are just the facts, Mr. President. Democrats, of course, have been kicking and screaming at the idea of spending reforms. You can witness their frantic campaign to portray the responsible reforms in House Republicans' bill as extreme, apparently suggesting that we should return to 2022 discretionary spending levels for 2024 is an extreme position, despite the fact that we were clearly doing just fine at those levels mere months ago. The Senate Democrat leader came down to the floor last Thursday and suggested that Republicans were attempting to pair a debt ceiling increase with, quote, unrelated partisan priorities. Unrelated partisan priorities. Well, let that just sink in for a minute, Mr. President, because according to the Senate Democrat leader, spending reform is a partisan priority that has nothing to do with increasing our nation's credit card limit. Mr. President, if a discussion over increasing our nation's credit card limit isn't a good time to have a discussion about spending, I don't know what is. And if spending reform is just a Republican priority, then there's something seriously wrong with the Democrat Party. Because with a national debt like ours, spending reform should be a priority for everyone. Our national debt currently stands at more than $31 trillion. $31 trillion. Our debt has already exceeded the size of our economy, and within a few short years, we're going to be spending more just meeting the interest on our nation's debt than we will on national defense. How do Democrats not realize that a national debt of that size has serious consequences? By 2024, we'll be spending more on interest than on Medicare. By 2050, we'll be spending more on interest than on Social Security. That is barely going to leave enough money for the government to meet its most basic obligations, much less invest in all the new or expanded government programs Democrats would like to implement. And yet, Democrats are apparently content to simply ignore this reality. It's like they think that we're going to find a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow to rescue us once we've spent the federal government into the ground. But there is no magic pot of gold, Mr. President. And before Democrats suggest it, let me just say that taxing the rich will not provide enough money to dig us out of the hole that we're in. We have to find a way to rein in federal spending. Otherwise, the size of our national debt is going to crush our economy and seriously limit the federal government's ability to meet even its most basic responsibilities, like funding Social Security and national defense. Mr. President, Democrats would like Americans to believe that the clean debt limit bill they're calling for is the standard when it comes to raising our nation's credit card limit. But in fact, that is very far from being the case, as the Democrat leader should know from his own experience in using the debt limit as leverage in negotiations. As Democrats should be well aware, 7 of the last 10 debt limit increases have included some mix of policy or budgetary changes rather than just a clean increase. And historically, spending reform has frequently gone hand in hand with debt ceiling legislation. Indeed, one expert recently noted in testimony before the Senate Budget Committee, and I quote, of the eight largest deficit reduction laws since 1985, all 8 were attached to debt limit bills, end quote. Let me repeat that, Mr. President. And this from an expert who recently provided testimony before the Senate Budget Committee. This was his quote: of the 8 largest deficit reduction laws since 1985, all 8 were attached to debt limit bills, end quote. Now, Mr. President, I'm getting a little tired of hearing Democrats dance around the facts or suggest that if Republicans just agree to the clean debt limit, debt ceiling increase that Democrats want, Democrats will be ready to talk about spending once we move on to the budget. Does anybody really seriously believe that if Democrats won't consider spending reforms now, that somehow they'll develop a serious enthusiasm for reining in spending once we get to the budget? Somehow it doesn't seem likely. Mr. President, Democrats and the President have spent a lot of energy over the past couple of weeks tearing down Republican proposals. If they'd spent half that time coming up with spending reforms of their own, we might already have a debt ceiling agreement. And I hope that the meeting at the White House later today is a sign that the President is actually getting serious about negotiating. Because if he isn't, he will have only himself to blame if our nation defaults on its obligations. Democrats have already spent us into an inflation crisis. Let's hope that they don't push us into a default crisis as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor.